When cattle baron Jackson Hayes first laid eyes on the Whitmore sisters arriving at his Wyoming ranch, he knew exactly which one he wanted to court. The stunning blonde beauty, Catherine. Her plain, bookish sister Emma was barely worth a glance, just another unremarkable woman destined to fade into the background of frontier life. But Jackson Hayes was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. Because while he was busy charming the wrong sister with expensive gifts and flowery words, a deadly cattle disease was spreading through his prize herd. A disease that only Emma Whitmore had the knowledge to identify and cure. The same plain sister he'd dismissed as worthless was about to become the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. And somewhere between saving his livelihood and challenging his arrogance, Emma would steal something far more valuable than his cattle. She'd steal his heart, leaving Jackson to face the hardest truth of all. He'd been blind to the most extraordinary woman who'd ever set foot on his land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rolling Creek Ranch as Emma Whitmore adjusted her simple brown dress and checked the contents of her leather satchel one final time. Inside were the tools of her unconventional trade, veterinary instruments she'd ordered from back east, medical journals filled with her careful notes, and samples of various herbs she'd been experimenting with for treating livestock ailments. At 26, Emma had resigned herself to being the forgotten sister, the one people's eyes skipped over when Catherine entered a room. Where Catherine possessed golden hair that caught sunlight like spun wheat and cornflower blue eyes that made men stumble over their words, Emma had inherited their mother's practical brown hair, unremarkable hazel eyes, and a tendency to prefer the company of books to people. But what Emma lacked in conventional beauty, she more than compensated for in intelligence and determination. While Catherine had spent their years in Denver learning to embroider and play piano, Emma had convinced the local veterinarian to teach her his trade. She'd studied every book on animal husbandry she could find, corresponded with agricultural colleges, and developed an almost mystical understanding of livestock behavior and health. Their father's death 6 months ago had left both sisters with limited options. Catherine's beauty would secure her a good marriage eventually, but Emma's prospects were far more uncertain. When word reached them that Jackson Hayes, the most successful rancher in Carbon County, Wyoming, was looking for educated help with his expanding cattle operation, Emma had convinced Catherine to make the journey west with her. Catherine, of course, saw it as an opportunity to meet and charm the wealthy rancher she'd heard so much about. Emma saw it as her chance to finally put her knowledge to practical use on a scale that mattered. Now, standing in the dusty yard of the most impressive ranch she'd ever seen, Emma wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The rolling creek spread stretched as far as the eye could see, with thousands of head of prime Hereford cattle dotting the grasslands like scattered coins. The ranch house itself was a monument to success, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that spoke of comfort and permanence. It was exactly the kind of place where a plain, bookish woman would be invisible. "Emma, stop fidgeting with that bag," Catherine chided, smoothing her own emerald traveling dress and adjusting her perfectly arranged curls. "You look like a peddler woman with all that equipment." "This equipment represents years of study and practice," Emma replied mildly, though she did shift the satchel to a less prominent position. "Mr. Hayes specifically requested someone with veterinary knowledge. Mr. Hayes is a man, sister dear, and men respond to beauty first, competence second." Catherine's smile was dazzling as she practiced the expression she'd use when meeting their potential employer. "Watch and learn." The front door of the ranch house opened, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. Jackson Hayes was not at all what she'd expected from their correspondence. Instead of the grizzled, weathered cattleman she'd imagined, he was perhaps 35, with dark hair and piercing grey eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He moved with the confident grace of a man who'd built an empire through intelligence, hard work and an iron will. He was also, Emma realized with a sinking heart, exactly the kind of man who would be immediately captivated by Catherine's obvious charms. "Ladies," Jackson said, descending the porch steps with measured strides. His voice was deep, cultured, with just enough of a Western drawl to remind listeners that he belonged to this land. "Welcome to Rolling Creek Ranch. I'm Jackson Hayes." Catherine stepped forward with practiced elegance, extending her gloved hand with the perfect mixture of confidence and demure charm. "Mr. Hayes, what a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Catherine Whitmore, and this is my sister Emma. Your ranch is absolutely magnificent." Jackson's eyes had indeed immediately fixed on Catherine, and Emma watched his expression shift from business-like courtesy to obvious male appreciation. The transformation was so complete, so predictable, that Emma almost laughed at her own foolish hopes. "Miss Catherine," Jackson said, taking her offered hand and holding it just a moment longer than propriety demanded. "The pleasure is entirely mine. I must say, your letters didn't prepare me for what, Mr. Hayes?" Catherine's laugh was like silver bells, musical and light, for meeting someone so lovely in this rough country. "Wyoming territory can be harsh on delicate sensibilities," Emma cleared her throat softly, stepping forward with her own introduction. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Emma Whitmore. I believe my letters detailed my experience with cattle veterinary care and agricultural management. I'm eager to examine your herd and discuss the consultation services you requested." Jackson's gaze shifted to Emma with polite but distant attention. "The kind of look one might give to a useful piece of equipment. Of course, Miss Emma, we'll certainly discuss your qualifications." His tone suggested he found those qualifications questionable at best. "But first, let me show you both to the house. Mrs. Rodriguez has prepared rooms for you." As they walked toward the impressive ranch house, Jackson positioned himself beside Catherine, engaging her in conversation about her journey, her impressions of the territory, her comfort and needs. Emma found herself walking slightly behind them, carrying both her professional satchel and her sister's lighter travel case. The interior of the ranch house was every bit as impressive as its exterior suggested. Rich hardwood floors were covered with beautiful rugs that spoke of prosperity and refined taste. The furniture was substantial without being ostentatious, and the walls were lined with books that indicated Jackson Hayes was far more than just a successful rancher. He was an educated man with intellectual interests. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd been running large households for decades. She welcomed both sisters warmly, but Emma noticed how her gaze lingered on Catherine with the same appreciation that men always showed. "I've prepared the blue room for Miss Catherine," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, leading them up the polished staircase. "It faces east and gets lovely morning light. Miss Emma, I've put you in the yellow room down the hall. Both have writing desks and comfortable reading chairs." The blue room was indeed beautiful, with elegant furnishings and delicate floral wallpaper that perfectly complemented Catherine's golden beauty. Emma's room, while comfortable, was clearly smaller and less ornate, the room typically reserved for less important guests. As they settled in for their first evening at Rolling Creek Ranch, Emma tried to focus on the opportunity ahead rather than the familiar sting of being overshadowed. During dinner, Jackson regaled them with stories of building his ranch from nothing, expanding his herds, and establishing trade relationships that stretched all the way to Chicago. The key to success in cattle ranching, Jackson explained, his attention focused entirely on Catherine, is understanding that cattle are investments, not pets. Every decision must be made with profit margins in mind. Emma set down her fork carefully. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, cattle are living creatures whose health directly impacts those profit margins. A rancher who treats them only as investments often finds those investments dying of preventable diseases." Jackson's grey eyes fixed on Emma with surprise and a hint of irritation. "Miss Emma, I've been running cattle successfully for over a decade. I think I understand the basics of livestock management." "I'm sure you understand the business aspects perfectly," Emma replied evenly. But business success and animal husbandry expertise aren't the same thing. From what I observed during our arrival, you have several indicators of potential health issues in your herd that could become significant problems if not addressed. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Catherine shot Emma a warning look, while Jackson's expression darkened with what Emma recognized as wounded male pride. "Perhaps," Jackson said with cool formality, "you could elaborate on these supposed issues you've identified after being here for all of 3 hours." Emma realized she'd made a tactical error, but it was too late to retreat now. "The cattle I observed in the near pasture showed signs of listlessness and reduced grazing behavior. Several animals had discharge from their eyes and noses, and I noticed at least 2 with labored breathing. Those symptoms together suggest the early stages of bovine respiratory disease complex, which can devastate a herd if not caught and treated quickly." Jackson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Miss Emma, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think you're seeing problems where none exist. My cattle are the finest Herefords in the territory, carefully bred and expertly managed. A few animals with runny noses hardly constitute a crisis. Mr. Hayes—" "Perhaps," Jackson interrupted, his tone making it clear the subject was closed, "we should discuss why you're really here. I requested consultation on improving my breeding program and expanding my operations. I'm sure your sister Catherine has valuable insights about managing the social aspects of running a large ranch." Emma felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time it came with genuine alarm. She'd spent enough years studying cattle diseases to recognize the early warning signs of a serious outbreak. If she was right about what she'd observed, Jackson Hayes was about to face a catastrophe that could destroy years of work and investment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But he clearly had no intention of listening to the plain sister when the beautiful one was available to charm and impress. After dinner, Emma excused herself early, claiming fatigue from travel. In reality, she wanted time to organize her thoughts and plan her next approach. From her bedroom window, she could see the cattle pastures in the moonlight, and her trained eye continued to pick out signs of distress in the animals' behavior. She pulled out her journal and began making detailed notes about what she'd observed, including sketches and calculations about potential spread rates if her suspicions proved correct. Tomorrow, she would need to find a way to examine the cattle more closely, with or without Jackson Hayes's permission. A soft knock at her door interrupted her work. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Rodriguez with extra blankets or towels. Instead, Catherine entered, her expression troubled. "Emma, we need to talk. If this is about dinner, it's about you embarrassing both of us with your know-it-all attitude." Catherine closed the door behind her and moved to sit on the edge of Emma's bed. "Mr. Hayes is clearly a successful, intelligent man. The last thing he needs is some unmarried woman trying to tell him how to run his business." Emma set down her pen carefully. "Catherine, I wasn't trying to show off. I genuinely believe there's a disease outbreak beginning in his herd. If I'm right, he could lose hundreds of cattle and thousands of dollars. And if you're wrong, you'll have ruined any chance either of us has of making a good impression here. Emma, be realistic. Mr. Hayes is exactly the kind of man who could provide security, comfort, and social standing. But he's not going to be interested in a woman who challenges his expertise at every turn. I'm not trying to challenge his expertise. I'm trying to share mine." Catherine's expression softened slightly. "Sister, I know you're brilliant with animals. I've seen you work miracles with sick horses and injured dogs back home. But this is different. This is about finding our place in the world. And your place isn't competing with men in their own field." Emma looked at her sister, beautiful, charming Catherine, who would never have to worry about being overlooked or dismissed, and felt a familiar mixture of love and frustration. "What if my place is exactly in this field? What if this is what I'm meant to do with my life? Then you'll spend your life alone, Emma. Is proving you're right about some cattle disease worth giving up the chance at marriage and family?" After Catherine left, Emma sat staring out her window at the moonlit pastures, wrestling with questions she'd been avoiding for years. Was her sister right? Was she sabotaging her own chances at a conventional life by insisting on pursuing knowledge and skills that made men uncomfortable? But then she thought about the cattle she'd observed, the subtle signs of illness that Jackson Hayes had dismissed so casually. If she was right, those animals were suffering, and their suffering would soon spread throughout the entire herd. Could she really stand by and watch a preventable disaster unfold just to avoid bruising a proud man's ego? Emma opened her journal again and continued writing. Tomorrow, she would find a way to get closer to those cattle, to confirm or disprove her suspicions. If she was wrong, she would apologize and fade into the background as Catherine suggested. But if she was right, Jackson Hayes was about to discover that the plain sister he'd so easily dismissed might be the only person who could save everything he'd worked to build. The question was, would his pride allow him to listen before it was too late? Outside her window, the cattle stood unusually still in the pale moonlight, and Emma's trained eye caught the subtle signs of distress that spelled disaster for the Rolling Creek Ranch. Whether Jackson Hayes wanted to admit it or not, his empire was about to face its greatest test, and the woman he'd barely noticed was the only one who saw it coming. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Wyoming landscape, painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber that took Emma's breath away. She'd risen before the rest of the household, determined to conduct her own examination of Jackson's cattle while everyone else slept. Her veterinary bag was packed with the instruments she'd need to confirm her suspicions, and her journal contained detailed notes about what she'd observed the previous evening. The morning air carried the sounds of a working ranch coming to life, horses nickering in the corrals, the distant lowing of cattle, and the cheerful whistling of ranch hands beginning their daily routines. Emma made her way toward the nearest pasture, moving quietly through the dewy grass. What she found confirmed her worst fears. 3 more cattle showed obvious signs of respiratory distress, standing with their heads lowered and breathing labored. The discharge from their eyes and noses had worsened overnight, and Emma could see the telltale signs of fever in their behavior. Excessive drooling, reluctance to move, and the glassy-eyed stare that indicated systemic illness. She was kneeling beside one of the affected animals, taking notes on its symptoms, when a gruff voice interrupted her concentration. "What in blazes are you doing to my cattle?" Emma looked up to find a weathered man in his 60s watching her with suspicion. His clothes marked him as the ranch foreman, and his expression suggested he didn't appreciate finding strange women examining his boss's livestock. "I'm Emma Whitmore," she said, rising slowly to avoid startling the sick animal. "Mr. Hayes invited my sister and me to consult on ranch operations. I'm conducting a health assessment of the herd." The foreman spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I'm Pete Sullivan, and I've been running cattle on this ranch for 15 years. Never needed some Eastern woman to tell me about my animals' health. Mr. Sullivan, I understand your concern, but I have significant experience with cattle diseases. These animals show clear signs of bovine respiratory disease complex, and without immediate treatment, you could lose a significant portion of the herd." Pete's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Lady, you've been here one night and you think you can diagnose my cattle. These animals are just adjusting to the change in weather. Happens every season." Emma pulled out her journal and showed him her detailed observations. "Seasonal adjustment doesn't cause bilateral nasal discharge, elevated respiratory rates, and the clustering patterns I've documented. This is a bacterial infection, likely Mannheimia hemolytica, and it's going to spread rapidly through the entire herd if we don't act quickly, Miss Whitmore." Jackson's voice cut across the pasture like a whip crack. Emma turned to see him striding toward them, his expression thunderous. He'd apparently dressed hastily. His shirt was only partially buttoned, and his dark hair was disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. "Mr. Hayes," Emma said calmly, closing her journal, "I was just explaining to Mr. Sullivan that you have a serious disease outbreak beginning in your cattle. What you were doing Jackson said, his grey eyes flashing with anger, was trespassing in my pastures and harassing my livestock without permission. I thought I made it clear last night that your services aren't required in this area. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Mr. Hayes, I understand you're upset, but the health of your cattle is more important than professional courtesy. These animals are sick, and they're going to get worse without immediate intervention. Miss Whitmore, I've been raising cattle since you were probably playing with dolls. I think I can tell the difference between healthy animals and sick ones. Can you? The words escaped before Emma could stop them. Because if you could, you'd see that the animal behind you is showing advanced symptoms of pneumonia and will probably be dead within 48 hours without treatment. Jackson spun around to look at the cow Emma had indicated, a young heifer that was standing apart from the others, her breathing shallow and rapid. As if summoned by Emma's prediction, the animal suddenly stumbled and went to her knees, struggling to rise again. The silence that followed was deafening. Pete Sullivan rushed to the fallen animal, while Jackson stared at the scene with a growing alarm. Emma knelt beside the heifer, pulling out her stethoscope to confirm what she already knew. Severe pulmonary congestion, she announced quietly. Her lung sounds indicate significant fluid buildup. Without immediate treatment with sulfur drugs and supportive care, she'll be dead by sunset. Jackson's face had gone pale. How did you know? Because I've been studying cattle diseases for 8 years, Mr. Hayes. I know what to look for, and I know how to treat it. Emma stood and faced him directly. The question is, are you going to let your pride cost you your herd? Before Jackson could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced another crisis. A young ranch hand rode up at full gallop, his face flushed with panic. "Boss!" he called out, jumping down from his horse. "We got problems in the south pasture. 5 more head down sick, and the others are scattering like they're spooked by something." Emma closed her eyes briefly, calculating the rate of spread she'd feared. "Mr. Hayes, how many head of cattle do you run on this ranch?" "About 3,000, Jackson replied, his voice tight with growing concern. "And how much of your total wealth is tied up in this herd?" "Nearly 80%, he admitted reluctantly. Emma opened her journal and showed him the projections she'd calculated the night before. "Based on the symptoms I've observed and the typical progression of this disease, you could lose between 30 and 50% of your cattle within 2 weeks. At current market prices, that represents a financial loss of approximately $40,000 to $60,000. The number hit Jackson like a physical blow. Emma could see him calculating, realizing that such a loss would bankrupt him, destroy everything he'd built over the past decade. What would you need to do to stop it?" he asked quietly. "Complete access to examine and treat the entire herd. Sulfur drugs, which I'll need to order from Denver immediately. Isolation facilities for the sick animals. And your complete cooperation, even when my methods seem unorthodox." Jackson looked at his sick cattle, at his worried foreman, at the young ranch hand who was waiting for orders. Then he looked at Emma, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. "All right, Miss Whitmore. You have carte blanche. Whatever you need, however you want to handle this, you're in charge of the medical aspects. Pete, give her whatever support she requires." Emma felt a rush of relief mixed with overwhelming responsibility. "I'll need to send a telegram to Denver immediately for the medicines, and we'll need to start segregating the sick animals to prevent further spread. I'll take you to town myself," Jackson said. "Pete, start separating any animal that shows symptoms, and send riders to check every pasture on the ranch. I want a complete count of affected cattle by noon." The ride to town was tense and mostly silent. Jackson drove the wagon with grim concentration, while Emma organized her treatment protocols and supply lists. The small town of Cedar Ridge was typical of Wyoming settlements, a single main street with essential businesses clustered around the railroad depot. At the telegraph office, Emma composed carefully worded messages to 3 different suppliers, ensuring that if one couldn't fill her order, the others might have what she needed. The medicines would be expensive, and she could see Jackson calculating the cost, even as he authorized the purchases. "There's something else," Emma said as they left the telegraph office. We'll need to inform the neighboring ranchers about the outbreak. This disease can spread through contact with infected animals, shared water sources, or even contaminated equipment. Jackson's jaw tightened. That will ruin my reputation. No one will want to do business with a rancher whose herd is diseased. Mr. Hayes, keeping this secret won't make the disease disappear. It will only ensure that it spreads to other herds, eventually destroying the entire region's cattle industry. Is that really what you want in your conscience? They made stops at 3 neighboring ranches, where Emma explained the symptoms to watch for and the precautions to take. The reactions ranged from concern to skepticism, with more than one rancher questioning whether Jackson was wise to put a woman in charge of such a serious crisis. Jim Bradley thinks you're either brilliant or completely insane, Jackson observed as they left the 3rd ranch. He's betting on the insane. What do you think? Emma asked. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. I think you saw something in 5 minutes that I missed in 5 months. That makes you either the most observant person I've ever met or incredibly lucky. And if the treatment works, then I owe you an apology the size of Wyoming territory. They returned to the ranch to find chaos. Pete Sullivan had identified 23 animals showing various stages of illness, from mild symptoms to severe respiratory distress. The sick cattle had been moved to a separate pasture near the ranch house, where Emma could monitor them closely. Emma threw herself into the work with single-minded determination. She examined each affected animal individually, documenting symptoms, taking temperatures, and categorizing them by severity of illness. The most critically ill animals would need immediate supportive care, while those in the early stages might respond to preventive treatment. Catherine appeared at the makeshift hospital pasture around mid-afternoon, picking her way carefully through the grass in her delicate shoes. Emma, you've been out here for hours. Mrs. Rodriguez has lunch prepared, and Mr. Hayes is asking about your progress. Emma looked up from the young bull she'd been examining, her dress stained with mud and her hair escaping from its pins. I can't stop now, Catherine. 2 more animals have developed severe symptoms just since this morning. The disease is progressing faster than I expected, but surely you could take a few minutes to clean up and eat something. You look positively wild. Emma glanced down at herself and realized Catherine was right. Her practical brown dress was dirty from kneeling in the dirt. Her hands were stained from handling sick animals, and she probably smelled like a barn. It was exactly the sort of appearance that would confirm everyone's opinion that she was unsuitable for polite society. The cattle can't wait for me to make myself presentable, Emma said firmly. This is life and death, Catherine. Appearance doesn't matter. Appearance always matters, Catherine replied, but her voice was gentler than usual. Emma, I can see how much this means to you, but you're working yourself to exhaustion. That won't help anyone. Before Emma could respond, Jackson appeared at the pasture fence. He'd changed from his hastily donned morning clothes into working gear, and Emma noticed he'd rolled up his sleeves as if preparing for physical labor. Miss Whitmore, how can I help? He asked simply. Emma blinked in surprise. You want to help? These are my cattle, my responsibility. If you're going to save them, I should at least understand what you're doing. For the next 2 hours, Jackson worked beside Emma as she continued her examinations. He held animals still while she took temperatures, fetched supplies from her veterinary bag, and listened intently as she explained what she was looking for in each case. Emma found herself watching him surreptitiously as they worked. There was something different about Jackson when he was focused on a task rather than trying to impress a beautiful woman. His movements were efficient and gentle with the animals, and he asked intelligent questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand her methods. This one, Emma said, indicating a cow that had been showing mild symptoms that morning, has developed a secondary infection. See how her breathing has become more labored, and there's blood in the discharge from her nose. Jackson leaned closer to observe what Emma was pointing out. What does that mean for her prognosis? It means she needs immediate aggressive treatment or we'll lose her. The infection has spread to her lower respiratory tract. Emma made notes in her journal, her handwriting quick but precise. We'll need to start her on double doses of medication as soon as it arrives from Denver. When will that be? Emma looked at the setting sun and calculated travel times. The earliest train could get here tomorrow afternoon. But Mr. Hayes, I have to be honest with you. Some of these animals may not survive that long. Jackson was quiet for a moment, studying the sick cattle with new understanding. Is there anything else we can do in the meantime?
Supportive care.
Keep them warm, ensure they have fresh water, and try to get them to eat if possible. Sometimes nursing care can make the difference between life and death. Then that's what we'll do. Jackson's voice carried a determination Emma hadn't heard before. I'll have the men set up shelters and braziers to keep the temperature stable. And Miss Whitmore? Yes, thank you. For seeing what I missed and for fighting to save them despite my reluctance to listen. As they walked back toward the ranch house in the gathering dusk, Emma felt something shifting between them. Jackson was no longer looking at her as an unwelcome intrusion or dismissing her as the plain sister. He was seeing her as she truly was, a woman with knowledge and skills that could make a real difference. But the greatest test still lay ahead. The medicines might not arrive in time, her treatments might not work, and Jackson Hayes might still lose everything he'd worked to build. The question was, even if she succeeded in saving his cattle, would she be able to save herself from falling in love with a man who might never see her as more than a useful colleague? The train whistle echoed across the prairie at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, carrying with it Emma's last hope for saving Jackson's cattle. She stood on the platform at Cedar Ridge Depot, her heart hammering as the locomotive pulled to a stop in a cloud of steam and coal smoke. 24 hours had passed since she'd sent those desperate telegrams, and in that time 6 more animals had fallen critically ill. Jackson paced beside her, his usual composed demeanor cracked by 48 hours of watching his life's work hang in the balance. Dark circles under his eyes testified to sleepless nights spent checking on sick cattle, while his clothes bore the stains of a man who'd abandoned vanity in favor of necessity. There, Emma said, spotting a railroad employee unloading wooden crates marked with pharmaceutical symbols. That should be our shipment from Denver. The medicine crates were heavier than expected, requiring 3 men to load them into Jackson's wagon. Emma verified the contents against her orders: sulfur drugs, respiratory stimulants, anti-inflammatory compounds, and the specialized equipment she'd need to administer treatments to large animals. Expensive cargo, the station master observed, counting the bills Jackson handed him. Must be some mighty sick animals. Mighty valuable ones, Jackson replied grimly. The ride back to the ranch was tense with anticipation. Emma mentally reviewed her treatment protocols, while Jackson pushed the horses harder than he normally would, both of them aware that every minute counted. In the pasture behind the ranch house, 42 cattle now showed various stages of illness. From the early symptoms Emma had first identified to the advanced respiratory distress that meant life or death decisions. Pete Sullivan met them at the gate, his weathered face grave. "Lost 2 more while you were gone," he reported. "That young heifer you said wouldn't make it, and old Brutus, the prize bull from the north pasture." Emma felt the loss like a physical blow. Brutus had been one of Jackson's finest breeding animals, worth more than most ranchers made in a year. But there was no time for grief or regret. Too many other lives hung in the balance. "Help me set up the treatment station," Emma instructed, already unpacking her supplies. "We'll start with the most critical cases and work our way through the entire group." What followed was 18 hours of the most intense veterinary work Emma had ever attempted. Using techniques she'd learned from textbooks and adapted through pure instinct, she administered medications, monitored vital signs, and made life-or-death decisions about treatment protocols. Jackson remained at her side throughout, learning to prepare injections, hold animals steady for examinations, and recognize the subtle signs of improvement or decline that would guide their next steps. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared periodically with food and coffee, while Catherine watched from the porch with obvious bewilderment at the unglamorous reality of Emma's expertise. By midnight, Emma was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Her hands shook as she prepared another round of medications, and she'd long since stopped caring about her appearance. Her dress was beyond salvation. Her hair had escaped all attempts at containment, and she smelled distinctly of livestock and medical compounds. "Miss Whitmore," Jackson said quietly, appearing at her elbow with a cup of coffee. "You need to rest. You're pushing yourself beyond human limits." "I can't stop now," Emma replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "This is the critical period. The next 6 hours will determine which animals survive and which ones—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood the stakes. Jackson studied her face in the lamplight, noting the exhaustion that made her hazel eyes appear enormous in her pale face. "Has anyone ever told you that you're remarkable?" Emma nearly dropped her coffee cup. "I'm sorry, what?" "Remarkable," Jackson repeated. "I've watched you work for 2 days straight, making decisions that could save or bankrupt me, and you never hesitate. You know exactly what needs to be done, and you do it. That's remarkable." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "No, you're doing what I couldn't do, what no one else could do." Jackson's voice carried a sincerity that made Emma's heart skip. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore, a profound one. Mr. Hayes, I dismissed you the moment you arrived because you didn't fit my narrow idea of what expertise should look like. I was so busy being charmed by your sister's obvious beauty that I completely overlooked your extraordinary capabilities." Emma stared at him, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected honesty. "You couldn't have known about my veterinary experience. I could have listened when you tried to tell me. I could have shown respect for your knowledge instead of assuming that a woman couldn't possibly understand cattle better than I did." Jackson set down his own coffee and faced her directly. "I've been a fool, Emma. A proud, stubborn fool who nearly lost everything because I couldn't see past my own prejudices." The use of her first name sent a flutter through Emma's chest. "You're not a fool, Jackson. You're a successful rancher who built all this from nothing. You had no reason to trust a stranger's diagnosis. I had every reason to trust your expertise if I'd bothered to recognize it." Jackson's grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell me honestly, if your treatments work, if you save my herd, what do you want in return?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I want recognition for my work. I want other ranchers to know that scientific veterinary care can prevent disasters like this one. And I want—" She paused, uncertain whether to voice her deepest hope. "What?" Jackson prompted gently. "I want to continue this work. I want to establish a proper veterinary practice where I can help other ranchers, other animals. I want to prove that knowledge and skill matter more than convention or appearance." Jackson nodded slowly. "And personally? What do you want for yourself, Emma?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Emma looked at this man who'd spent 2 days working beside her, who'd seen her at her most unglamorous and called her remarkable, who was looking at her now as if she were the most important person in his world. "I want to be valued for who I am," she said quietly. "Not compared to anyone else, not judged by conventional standards, but appreciated for my own qualities and contributions." "You are," Jackson said simply. "More than you know." Before Emma could respond to that loaded statement, a commotion from the cattle pasture demanded their attention. One of the animals, a young cow who'd been among the most critically ill, had gotten to her feet and was walking toward the water trough with steady, determined steps. "Look at that," Jackson breathed, wondering in his voice. "She's actually improving." Emma felt a surge of hope as she examined the cow more closely. The animal's breathing was noticeably easier, her eyes were clearer, and the discharge from her nose had decreased significantly. "The medication is working," Emma said, hardly daring to believe it. "If she's responding this well, the others should follow the same pattern." Dawn revealed the scope of their success. Of the 42 animals that had been critically ill, 38 showed marked improvement. 3 more had died during the night, but the remaining cattle were eating, drinking, and moving around the pasture with increasing energy. Emma allowed herself a moment of pure triumph as she surveyed the results of her work. She'd done it. Saved Jackson's herd and potentially his entire ranch through nothing but knowledge, determination, and 18 hours of backbreaking effort. Miss Whitmore, Pete Sullivan approached her with something she'd never seen on his weathered face: respect. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. Been ranching for 30 years and I've never seen anything like what you did here." "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. But this is just the beginning. We'll need to continue monitoring these animals for at least another week and implement prevention protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." "Whatever you say, ma'am. You're the boss when it comes to cattle health." Word of Emma's success spread quickly through the territory. By noon, 3 neighboring ranchers had arrived to see the results for themselves and ask for consultations about their own herds. By evening, a reporter from the Cheyenne newspaper was interviewing Emma about her methods and their dramatic results. "Miss Whitmore," the reporter asked, scribbling notes in a leather-bound pad, "what would you say to those who claim that veterinary medicine is no field for a woman?" Emma considered her answer carefully, aware that her words would be read throughout the territory. "I would say that animals don't care about the gender of the person treating them. They only care about competence, knowledge, and dedication to their welfare. If more women had the opportunity to study and practice veterinary medicine, I believe we'd see fewer disasters like the one that nearly destroyed the Rolling Creek Ranch." Jackson, who'd been listening from across the room, stepped forward. "I can personally attest to Miss Whitmore's exceptional abilities. She saved my entire operation through her expertise and tireless effort. Any rancher in this territory would be fortunate to have access to her services." The public endorsement from one of the region's most successful cattlemen carried enormous weight. Emma could see it in the reporter's expression, in the respectful attention of the visiting ranchers, in the way even Catherine was looking at her with new eyes. But it was Jackson's expression that mattered most to Emma, the way he looked at her not as a useful colleague or a surprising discovery, but as a woman he was beginning to see in an entirely new light. That evening, after the reporter had left, and the visiting ranchers had returned to their own spreads, Emma finally allowed herself to bathe and change into clean clothes. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman transformed, not physically but in some fundamental way that went beyond appearance. She'd proven herself in the most demanding circumstances possible. She'd saved Jackson's ranch and earned the respect of men who'd initially dismissed her completely. She'd established herself as a professional with valuable skills that could make a real difference in the world. Most importantly, she'd forced Jackson Hayes to see past his preconceptions and recognize her true worth. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reflections. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Rodriguez with fresh towels or Catherine with some sisterly observation. Instead, Jackson entered, his expression serious but not unkind. "Emma, we need to talk." "Of course." Emma gestured toward the chairs by the window, suddenly nervous about what this conversation might bring. Jackson remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture she'd come to recognize as indicating serious thought. "The doctor in town examined Brutus and the other animals we lost. He confirmed your diagnosis completely, bovine respiratory disease complex, exactly as you predicted. I'm glad to have the confirmation, though I wish it had come under better circumstances." "Emma, do you realize what you've accomplished here? You saved 38 head of prime cattle, worth approximately $20,000 at current market prices. You prevented a disease outbreak that could have devastated every ranch in the territory, and you did it all with knowledge and skills that no one else in this region possesses." Emma nodded slowly, uncertain where Jackson was leading with this praise. "I want to offer you a permanent position," Jackson continued, "head veterinarian for the Rolling Creek Ranch, with authority over all aspects of cattle health and disease prevention. The salary would be substantial, more than most men make in this territory." Emma's breath caught. It was everything she'd dreamed of professionally: recognition, authority, financial independence, and the chance to continue the work she loved. But something in Jackson's formal tone, his careful distance, suggested that this offer was purely professional. He was offering her a job, not a life. "It's a generous offer," Emma said carefully. "May I ask what prompted it?" "Practical necessity," Jackson replied, though his eyes suggested more complex motivations. "I can't risk another outbreak like this one. Having you on staff would be the best insurance policy I could possibly purchase." Insurance policy. The words stung more than Emma cared to admit. After everything they'd shared over the past few days, after working side by side and seeing each other at their most vulnerable, Jackson was still thinking of her primarily in terms of her utility. "And Catherine?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Jackson's expression grew complicated. "Your sister is lovely, charming, and would make any man a beautiful wife. But Emma." "Yes. I find myself far more interested in a woman who can save my cattle than one who can merely ornament my parlor." The admission hung between them, loaded with possibilities that neither was quite ready to explore fully. Emma realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life: accept Jackson's professional offer and remain in his orbit while keeping their relationship safely business-focused, or push for something more personal and risk losing everything she'd gained. "I'll need time to consider your offer," Emma said finally. Jackson nodded, though she caught a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Of course. Take all the time you need." After he left, Emma sat by her window, looking out at the cattle pastures, where her patients grazed peacefully in the moonlight. She'd accomplished more in the past 3 days than in years of studying and dreaming, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead, deciding whether Jackson Hayes was offering her a job or a future, and whether she had the courage to find out which one she truly wanted. The engagement announcement sent shockwaves through Carbon County, Wyoming. Within 24 hours of Jackson's proposal, it seemed every rancher, shopkeeper, and socialite within a 100-mile radius had an opinion about the Plain sister, who'd somehow managed to capture the territory's most eligible bachelor. Emma discovered this when she accompanied Jackson to town 3 days later for what should have been a routine trip to order supplies. Instead, she found herself the subject of curious stares, whispered conversations, and the occasional bold inquiry from townspeople who'd never shown her the slightest interest before. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Aberdeen, the banker's wife, cornered them outside the general store with the predatory smile of someone hunting for gossip. "Such exciting news about your engagement. I must say everyone is simply fascinated by the story of how you captured Mr. Hayes's attention." The emphasis on "captured" made Emma's jaw tighten, but Jackson smoothly intervened. "Mrs. Aberdeen, I believe you have it backwards. Miss Whitmore didn't capture my attention. She earned my respect and admiration through her extraordinary professional abilities and personal character. I consider myself fortunate that she accepted my proposal." Mrs. Aberdeen's smile faltered at this unexpected response. "Oh, of course. How modern of you both." As they continued through town, Emma noticed similar reactions everywhere. The women seemed torn between envy and bewilderment, unable to understand how someone they dismissed as unremarkable could have won such a prize. The men's reactions varied from respectful acknowledgement of her professional reputation to barely concealed skepticism about Jackson's choice. "Are you having second thoughts?" Emma asked Jackson quietly as they loaded supplies into their wagon. "About what?" "About marrying a woman who makes people scratch their heads and wonder what you could possibly see in her." Jackson stopped loading grain sacks and turned to face her fully. Emma, do you know what I see when I look at you? Someone who doesn't fit conventional expectations. I see a woman who saved my ranch through sheer brilliance and determination. I see someone who works 18-hour days because she genuinely cares about the welfare of animals that can't speak for themselves. I see a partner who challenges me to be better, who brings knowledge and skills that complement my own perfectly. His voice softened. I see the woman I want to spend my life with, building something extraordinary together. Emma felt warmth spread through her chest, but she couldn't quite shake her concerns. Jackson, what happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize you could have married Catherine, or any number of beautiful conventional women who would have made your social life much easier? Emma, Jackson's voice carried a note of frustration. Do you think so little of me that you believe I'd propose marriage based on novelty? Do you think I'm so shallow that I'd choose a wife the way I'd choose a pretty ornament for my mantelpiece? No, of course not. But people are already talking. Let them talk. Jackson's expression grew determined. Emma, I've spent years listening to what other people thought I should want, should do, should value. It nearly cost me everything when I almost sold the ranch to those consortium vultures. I'm not going to make that mistake again. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Fletcher, a neighboring rancher whose spread bordered the Rolling Creek property. Fletcher was known throughout the territory for his traditional views and his success with a more conventional approach to cattle ranching. "Hayes," Fletcher called out, dismounting from his horse with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent 40 years in the saddle. "Heard congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Tom," Jackson replied carefully, clearly uncertain of Fletcher's intentions. "Miss Whitmore," Fletcher turned to Emma with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Understand you're the one who diagnosed that disease outbreak on Jackson's property." "I am," Emma confirmed, lifting her chin slightly at something in Fletcher's tone. "Interesting approach, bringing in outside expertise." Fletcher's weathered face showed no particular expression. "Of course, I've been running cattle for 23 years without needing any fancy veterinary consultation." Emma felt the familiar sting of dismissal. But before she could respond, Jackson stepped closer to her side. "Tom, Miss Whitmore's intervention saved me approximately $30,000 in livestock losses. I'd say that makes her expertise rather valuable, wouldn't you?" Fletcher's eyebrows rose at the figure. 30,000? "That's a substantial sum." "It is indeed," Jackson agreed, "which is why I've asked Miss Whitmore to establish a permanent veterinary practice based at Rolling Creek Ranch. We'll be offering disease prevention and treatment services to ranchers throughout the territory." Emma stared at Jackson in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of any such expansion, though the idea sent excitement coursing through her veins. "Joint venture," Jackson continued, his hand finding the small of Emma's back in a gesture of support. "My wife will be my full partner in all ranch operations, including this new enterprise." Fletcher digested this information slowly. "Partnership, you say? Interesting approach. Very interesting," agreed a new voice. Emma turned to see Dr. Samuel Morrison, the elderly town physician, approaching with a leather medical bag in his hand. "Miss Whitmore, I've been hoping to speak with you about your treatment methods. Word of your success has reached the Territorial Medical Board." Emma's pulse quickened. "The Medical Board?" "Indeed. They're quite interested in your diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols. There's talk of establishing formal veterinary standards for the territory, and your recent success makes you a natural candidate to help develop those standards." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Fletcher asking detailed questions about Emma's methods, and Dr. Morrison discussing the possibility of her presenting her findings to medical professionals in Cheyenne. By the time they parted ways, Emma's head was spinning with new possibilities. "You didn't tell me about expanding the veterinary practice," Emma said as they drove back toward the ranch. Jackson's smile was slightly sheepish. "I wanted to surprise you, and honestly, I wanted to see if the idea appealed to you before making formal plans." "Jackson, the idea of establishing veterinary standards for the entire territory." Emma trailed off, overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing. That could change everything for livestock health throughout Wyoming. Exactly. Emma, you have knowledge and abilities that could benefit thousands of animals and dozens of ranchers. Keeping that expertise limited to just our ranch would be criminal. Emma studied his profile as he guided the wagon along the familiar road home. This partnership you're offering, it's not just about marriage, is it? It's about recognizing that we're both stronger together than we could ever be apart. You have the veterinary expertise, I have the business connections and financial resources. Together, we could build something that matters far beyond our personal happiness. The scope of Jackson's vision was breathtaking. Emma had dreamed of professional recognition and the chance to practice veterinary medicine, but she'd never imagined the possibility of establishing territorial standards or influencing livestock health policy across an entire region. There's something else we need to discuss. Jackson continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Catherine, Emma turned to face him more directly. What about Catherine? She's been remarkably gracious about our engagement, especially considering that I initially seemed more interested in her than in you. But Emma, I need you to know that I never proposed to her, never made promises I'm now breaking. I know that, Jackson. Do you? Because I've seen the way you look sometimes, as if you're waiting for me to realize I've made a mistake. As if you expect me to wake up one morning and wonder why I chose the plain sister over the beautiful one. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering his words. I suppose I do worry about that sometimes. Then let me put your concerns to rest once and for all. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop in a grove of cottonwood trees, turning to face her fully. Emma, I was initially attracted to Catherine because she represented everything I thought I was supposed to want. Conventional beauty, social graces, the kind of wife who would look perfect at territorial social functions. Emma nodded, though the words stung, despite their honesty. But attraction based on meeting social expectations isn't love. Emma, it's not even genuine preference, it's just following a script someone else wrote. Jackson took her hands in his grey eyes intense. What I feel for you is completely different. It's based on respect for who you are, admiration for what you've accomplished, and genuine excitement about what we could build together. It's based on love, Emma, real love. Jackson, I'm not finished. His grip on her hands tightened slightly. I love your brilliant mind and your stubborn determination. I love the way you forget about everything else when you're focused on helping a sick animal. I love that you challenge me, push me to be better, refuse to let me settle for easy answers. I love that you see possibilities where others see only problems. Emma felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his voice. Most of all, Jackson continued, I love that when you look at me, you see not what I appear to be, but who I actually am. You see through the successful rancher facade to the man who sometimes doubts himself, who makes mistakes, who's still learning and growing. And somehow, incredibly, you love that man anyway. Jackson, Emma whispered, I do love you, more than I ever thought possible. Then marry me, he said, though they'd already settled this question. Not because it's practical or convenient or socially advantageous, but because we love each other and want to build a life together. Yes, Emma said, leaning forward to kiss him. Yes, for all those reasons and more. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Jackson reluctantly released Emma and looked toward the sound, his expression growing concerned as he recognized the urgency in the hoofbeats. Boss. It was young Tommy Carson, one of their ranch hands, riding hard toward them with obvious panic. Boss, you need to come quick. We got into big trouble at the ranch. Jackson was immediately alert, his romantic moment forgotten in the face of potential crisis. What kind of trouble, Tommy? Fire, boss. It started in the hay barn, and it's spreading fast. Mrs. Rodriguez got everyone out safely, but the buildings... Emma felt ice form in her stomach. Fire was every rancher's worst nightmare, capable of destroying years of work in hours. She thought of her beautiful veterinary office, of Jackson's carefully built empire, of all their plans for the future. How bad? Jackson asked, already turning the wagon around. Bad, boss. Real bad. And there's more. Some of the cattle broke through the fence trying to get away from the smoke. They're scattered all over creation, and some of them are the ones Miss Emma treated for that sickness. Emma's mind immediately shifted into crisis mode. The cattle she'd saved were now in danger again, and if they were scattered and stressed, their recovery could be threatened. Worse, if they'd been exposed to smoke, they could develop secondary respiratory complications that might prove fatal. "Jackson, we need to get back immediately," she said, her veterinary training overriding her personal concerns. Smoke exposure can cause serious lung damage, especially in animals that were recently treated for respiratory disease. Jackson nodded grimly and urged the horses into a gallop. As they raced back toward Rolling Creek Ranch, Emma could see a column of black smoke rising from the direction of home, and her heart sank at the implications. Everything they'd built together, everything they'd planned for their future, was quite literally going up in smoke. But as she looked at Jackson's determined profile, Emma realized something important. They would face this crisis the same way they'd faced the cattle disease outbreak, together as partners, combining their strengths to overcome whatever challenges awaited them. The question was, would their love and partnership be strong enough to survive losing everything they'd worked to build? As the smoke grew thicker and the smell of burning timber filled the air, Emma and Jackson raced toward an uncertain future, knowing that the greatest test of their relationship was about to begin. The scene that greeted Emma and Jackson as they crested the final hill toward Rolling Creek Ranch was worse than either had dared imagine. The hay barn was completely engulfed in flames, sending towers of orange fire and black smoke high into the Wyoming sky. The main barn's roof was beginning to smolder, and Emma could see bucket brigades of ranch hands desperately trying to wet down the other buildings before the fire could spread further. But it was the scattered cattle that made Emma's heart sink. Hundreds of animals were running in panicked groups across the rangeland, their instinctual fear of fire overriding any training or fence barriers. Among them, she could identify several of the animals she'd treated for respiratory disease, animals whose lungs were still recovering and who were now breathing smoke-filled air. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jackson called out as they pulled up to the house, where the housekeeper was directing the salvaging of household goods. "What started this?" "Lightning strike about 2 hours ago," the older woman replied, wiping soot from her forehead with a dirty apron. "Hit the hay barn directly. We've lost most of the winter feed, and the fire's threatening the equipment shed." Emma jumped down from the wagon before Jackson could help her, her mind already shifting into crisis management mode. "How many cattle scattered? And which direction did they go?" Pete Sullivan appeared through the smoke, his weathered face grim. "Near as we can tell, about 400 head broke through the north fence. They're spread out over maybe 10 square miles of rough country. Some headed toward the river, others up into the hills. The ones I treated for respiratory disease. Most of them were in that group, Miss Emma. They were already spooked from being sick, and the smoke sent them into full panic." Emma felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She'd saved those animals from one crisis, only to see them endangered by another. If they weren't found and brought back quickly, stress and smoke exposure could trigger relapses that might prove fatal. "Jackson," she said, turning to find him organizing the firefighting efforts, "I need to go after those cattle immediately. The ones that were sick, if they don't receive follow-up care and get separated from the smoke, we could lose them all anyway." Jackson paused in his coordination of the bucket brigade. "Emma, it's a dangerous country out there, especially with panicked cattle. And we need every hand here fighting the fire. The fire is either going to burn itself out or destroy everything regardless of what I do," Emma replied firmly. "But those cattle are alive right now, and I can still save them. That's where I can make the most difference." For a moment, Jackson looked torn between his desire to keep Emma safe and his recognition that she was right about where her expertise was most needed. Finally, he nodded. "Take Tommy and Pete with you. And Emma, be careful." Emma was already moving toward the corral, where several horses were still saddled from the day's work. "I'll bring them home. she called over her shoulder. All of them. The next 6 hours tested every skill Emma had learned during her years of studying animal behavior and veterinary medicine. Following the scattered herds trail across broken country, she and her 2 companions located groups of frightened cattle hiding in ravines, clustered around water sources, and wandering aimlessly through unfamiliar territory. The animals were in various states of distress, some showing signs of smoke inhalation, others with injuries from crashing through fences or stumbling over rough ground in their panic. Emma treated what she could in the field, using the medical supplies she'd grabbed from her veterinary office before leaving the ranch. "This bunch looks pretty good," Pete reported as they rounded up a group of 20 cattle near Bear Creek. "But they're mighty spooked still." Emma examined the animals quickly, checking for respiratory distress and obvious injuries. "They'll be fine once we get them away from the smoke smell. But Pete, look at this heifer. See how she's standing with her head extended and breathing shallow." The foreman squinted at the animal Emma had indicated. "Smoke inhalation?" "Exactly. And if I'm right, there are probably others showing similar symptoms that we haven't spotted yet." Emma made notes in the small journal she'd brought along. "We need to get them back to the ranch, where I can treat them properly." As they worked to gather the scattered herd, Emma found herself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been an unknown woman with unconventional knowledge that no one wanted to acknowledge. Now she was racing across Wyoming rangeland, using that same knowledge to save hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of livestock while the man she loved fought to save their home from destruction. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd initially come to Rolling Creek Ranch, hoping to prove her professional worth, only to discover that her real value lay not just in her expertise, but in her partnership with someone who recognized and supported that expertise. "Miss Emma," Tommy Carson called from a ridge above their position. "Found another bunch down in Miller's Canyon. It looks like maybe 40 heads, but some of them are down." Emma's heart clenched as she spurred her horse toward the canyon. Animals that were down in the wild usually meant serious injury or illness. Exactly what she'd feared might happen to cattle whose systems were already compromised from their recent disease outbreak. Miller's Canyon was a narrow ravine cut by seasonal streams, with steep rocky sides that would trap frightened animals. As Emma rode down the treacherous slope, she could see what had happened. Several cattle had injured themselves, sliding down the rocky walls in their panic, while others were showing severe respiratory distress from smoke exposure combined with their previous illness. "Pete, Tommy, I need you to start gathering the healthy animals and moving them back toward the ranch," Emma instructed as she dismounted and began examining the injured cattle. "I'm going to stay here and treat the worst cases before trying to move them." "Miss Emma, it'll be dark soon," Pete warned. "These canyons ain't safe at night, especially with injured animals." Emma looked at the cattle around her, animals she'd fought to save just days earlier, now facing a different but equally deadly crisis. "I'm not leaving them, Pete. These animals trusted me to heal them once. I won't abandon them now." What followed was one of the longest nights of Emma's life. Working by lamplight in the bottom of Miller's Canyon, she treated smoke inhalation, cleaned and bandaged cuts from sharp rocks, and provided supportive care to animals whose systems were fighting multiple stresses at once. 2 of the cattle were beyond help, their injuries too severe and their respiratory distress too advanced for field treatment. Emma made the difficult decision to end their suffering, a responsibility that came with her expertise but never got easier. But the others responded to her care. By dawn, she had stabilized 6 seriously injured animals and treated a dozen others for various combinations of smoke inhalation, cuts, and stress-related complications. More importantly, she'd managed to calm the entire group enough that they could be safely moved back to the ranch. The sun was rising as Emma finally led the last group of recovered cattle through the gates of Rolling Creek Ranch. What she saw made her heart soar with relief. The fire had been contained and extinguished, though the hay barn was a total loss, and several other buildings showed significant damage. Jackson appeared at the corral gate, his clothes blackened with soot and his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Emma, thank God. We've been worried sick about you. I told you I'd bring them home, Emma replied, sliding down from her horse with legs shaky from exhaustion. All of them could be saved. Jackson caught her as she stumbled, holding her steady while she found her balance. How many did we lose? 2 that were too badly injured to save. The rest are going to recover fully with proper care. Emma leaned against Jackson's solid warmth, finally allowing herself to acknowledge how exhausted and emotionally drained she was. Jackson, what about the ranch? How bad is the damage? Bad enough, Jackson admitted. We lost the hay barn completely, and there's damage to the main barn and equipment shed. But Emma, the important thing is that everyone's safe, and thanks to you, we still have our cattle. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with hot coffee and a concerned expression. Miss Emma, you look ready to drop. Come inside and get cleaned up while the men handle the cattle. But Emma shook her head, straightening with determination. Not yet. I need to examine every animal we brought back, document their conditions, and start treatment protocols for the ones with smoke inhalation. This crisis isn't over until I'm sure they're all going to recover completely. Jackson started to protest, but Emma cut him off with a look that reminded him exactly why he'd fallen in love with this remarkable woman. Jackson, this is what I do. This is who I am. You can either help me or stay out of my way. But I'm not stopping until I'm satisfied that every animal is receiving proper care. For the next 3 hours, Emma worked with systematic thoroughness, examining each returned animal and documenting their conditions in her veterinary journal. Jackson worked beside her, holding animals for examination and learning to recognize the subtle signs of respiratory distress that might indicate developing complications. This is remarkable, Dr. Morrison said, appearing at the corral fence around mid-morning. I came to check on fire damage and heard you'd spent the night treating injured cattle in Miller's Canyon. Emma looked up from the young bull she was examining, noting that the physician carried his medical bag and wore an expression of professional interest. Dr. Morrison, I'm afraid I haven't had time to clean up properly. Miss Whitmore, I'm not here to assess your appearance. I'm here because word of your work last night has already reached town, and I suspect it will reach Cheyenne by tomorrow. The elderly doctor approached the corral with careful steps. What you accomplished, conducting field veterinary surgery by lamplight, treating complex combinations of injuries and illnesses under primitive conditions, saving dozens of valuable animals that would otherwise have been lost. That's exactly the kind of expertise the Territorial Medical Board needs to establish veterinary standards. Emma felt a flutter of excitement despite her exhaustion. Are you saying... I'm saying that I'm prepared to recommend you for immediate certification as a territorial veterinary practitioner. By passing the usual examination requirements based on your demonstrated expertise. Dr. Morrison's expression grew serious. Miss Whitmore, you've proven that scientific veterinary medicine can make the difference between economic disaster and recovery for ranchers throughout Wyoming. That's knowledge that needs to be shared and formalized. Jackson stepped closer to Emma's side, his expression proud. What would certification mean practically? It would mean official recognition of Miss Whitmore's expertise, the authority to establish veterinary standards for the territory, and the legal backing to expand her practice to serve ranchers throughout Wyoming and beyond. Dr. Morrison smiled at Emma's stunned expression. Congratulations, Miss Whitmore. You're about to become the first officially certified veterinary practitioner in Wyoming territory. Emma stared at the elderly physician, hardly able to process what he was offering. Official recognition, legal authority, the chance to establish veterinary standards that could benefit thousands of animals and dozens of ranching operations throughout the territory. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of professionally, and more than she'd ever dared hope for. But as she looked at Jackson's proud smile and felt his steady presence beside her, Emma realized that the greatest prize wasn't the professional recognition or the expanded opportunities. The greatest prize was having found a partner who recognized her worth, supported her ambitions, and loved her for exactly who she was, a brilliant, unconventional woman who happened to be extraordinarily good at saving lives. whether they belonged to cattle or to the people who depended on them. Dr. Morrison, Emma said, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. I accept your recommendation with gratitude. But I want to make one thing clear. This practice will be based at Rolling Creek Ranch, in partnership with my future husband. We're building something together that's bigger than either of us could accomplish alone. Jackson's arm tightened around her waist, and Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners, combining her expertise with his vision to create something extraordinary. The fire had destroyed their hay barn and damaged their buildings. But it had also proven something important. Their partnership was strong enough to survive any crisis, and their love was built on a foundation solid enough to support the ambitious dreams they shared. 6 months after the fire that had threatened to destroy everything, Emma stood in the doorway of the newly constructed veterinary hospital at Rolling Creek Ranch, watching the morning sun illuminate what had become the most advanced animal medical facility in Wyoming territory. The building that had risen from the ashes was twice the size of her original office, equipped with surgical suites, recovery stalls, and a laboratory that would allow her to conduct the research necessary for establishing territorial veterinary standards. But more impressive than the physical facility was the steady stream of visitors it attracted. This morning alone, she'd already examined cattle from 3 different ranches, consulted on a disease prevention program for a sheep operation near Laramie, and reviewed case studies that would become part of the official veterinary protocols she was developing for the territorial government. Busy morning, Jackson observed, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of a man watching his wife's dreams come true in spectacular fashion. Busier than I ever imagined possible, Emma agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. Tom Fletcher is bringing his entire herd for preventive examinations next week, and I received a telegram yesterday from ranchers in Colorado asking about consultation services. Jackson's smile widened. Who would have thought that Tom Fletcher would become one of your biggest supporters? Emma laughed, remembering the skeptical rancher who'd questioned her expertise just months earlier. He changed his tune when his neighbor lost 40 heads to the same respiratory disease that could have devastated your herd. Suddenly, fancy veterinary consultation didn't seem so unnecessary. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, who approached the veterinary hospital with her usual elegant grace. Though Emma noticed her sister now carried herself with a new confidence that spoke of her own recent successes. "Sister dear," Catherine called out, her smile genuine and warm. "I hope you have time for a brief visit before your next patient arrives." Emma embraced her sister, noting the quality of Catherine's new traveling dress and the sparkle of genuine happiness in her blue eyes. "Of course. Jackson was just telling me about your latest letter from Denver. How are things developing with Mr. Ashford?" Catherine's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Wonderfully. Richard has proposed, and I've accepted. We're planning a Christmas wedding at his family's home in Denver." Jackson stepped forward to offer his congratulations. "Richard Ashford is a fortunate man. When will you be moving to Colorado?" "After the wedding, but I'll be visiting frequently. I could never stay away from my sister's remarkable transformation into the most famous veterinarian in the territory." Catherine's tone held genuine pride rather than the sisterly competition Emma had grown accustomed to. "Emma, I owe you an apology." Emma set down her coffee cup, surprised by the serious turn in Catherine's voice. "For what?" "For spending years assuming that your unconventional interests were a liability rather than a gift. For believing that conforming to social expectations was more important than developing your extraordinary abilities." Catherine's expression grew earnest. "Watching you save Jackson's ranch, establish this practice, and earn the respect of the entire territory has taught me something important about the difference between being admired and being valued." "Catherine, let me finish," Catherine interrupted gently. "Richard fell in love with me, not just because I'm decorative, but because I challenged him intellectually, because I have opinions about his business ventures, Because I bring something substantial to our partnership. You taught me that by example, by refusing to settle for being merely ornamental. Emma felt tears threatening at her sister's unexpected words. You were never merely ornamental, Catherine. You've always been intelligent and capable, but I was afraid to show those qualities because I thought they would make me less appealing to men. You proved that the right man, a man worth having, values intelligence and capability above conventional prettiness. Catherine glanced at Jackson with approval. You chose well, sister. We chose each other, Jackson corrected with a smile. And we're both better for it. Their family reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A delegation of well-dressed men was riding up the lane toward the ranch house. Not the typical work clothes of ranchers seeking veterinary services, but the formal attire of officials conducting important business. Territorial representatives, Jackson observed, recognizing the lead rider. That's Governor Warren's secretary, along with several members of the Legislative Council. Emma felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. She'd been expecting this visit ever since Dr. Morrison had submitted her certification papers to Cheyenne. But the reality of facing territorial officials was still intimidating. Mrs. Hayes, the governor's secretary called out as the delegation dismounted near the veterinary hospital. I'm David Sinclair, representing Governor Warren. We're here to discuss the proposed territorial veterinary standards and your appointment as Chief Veterinary Officer. Emma exchanged glances with Jackson, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. Gentlemen, welcome to Rolling Creek Ranch. Would you like to tour the facilities before we discuss the administrative details? What followed was the most important professional presentation of Emma's life. She led the delegation through her veterinary hospital, explaining her treatment protocols, showing them the detailed records she kept of every case, and demonstrating the diagnostic techniques that had saved Jackson's herd and dozens of others since then. Remarkable facility, commented Senator Morrison. No relation to the town physician, but equally impressed by Emma's work. And your success rate with disease prevention and treatment? Approximately 93% recovery rate for animals treated in the early stages of illness, Emma replied confidently. More importantly, we've prevented several potential outbreaks through early intervention and proper herd management protocols. The officials spent 3 hours examining Emma's work, interviewing neighboring ranchers who'd benefited from her services, and reviewing the detailed treatment records that would form the basis for territorial veterinary standards. Mrs. Hayes, Governor Warren's secretary, finally announced, I'm authorized to offer you the position of Chief Veterinary Officer for Wyoming Territory, with authority to establish and enforce animal health standards throughout the region. The position comes with substantial administrative responsibilities, but also significant influence over agricultural policy. Emma felt her heart race at the scope of what was being offered. What would this mean practically? It would mean establishing veterinary requirements for all commercial ranching operations, training and certifying other veterinary practitioners, and serving as the territorial authority on animal health matters. You'd be based here at your ranch, but travel extensively throughout Wyoming and coordinate with similar positions in other territories. Jackson stepped closer to Emma's side, his expression proud but concerned. That sounds like it would require Emma to be away from home frequently. The position would indeed involve considerable travel, Sinclair acknowledged. Though we understand that Mrs. Hayes operates as part of a partnership, and we'd welcome Mr. Hayes's involvement in the administrative aspects of the program. Emma looked at Jackson, reading the mix of pride and concern in his gray eyes. This was the culmination of everything she'd worked toward. Official recognition, territorial authority, the chance to establish veterinary standards that could benefit the entire region. But it would also mean months away from the ranch they'd rebuilt together, from the partnership that had made all her success possible. Gentlemen, Emma said finally, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to discuss the practical arrangements with my husband before making a decision of this magnitude. After the officials departed, with promises to return in a week for her answer, Emma found herself alone with Jackson on the porch of their rebuilt ranch house. The sun was setting over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the morning she'd first arrived at Rolling Creek Ranch. "It's everything you dreamed of," Jackson said quietly. Though his voice carried undertones Emma couldn't quite identify. "It's more than I ever dared dream of," Emma corrected. "Jackson, they're offering me the chance to influence animal health policy throughout the entire territory. The impact could be enormous, I know, and I'm proud of you for earning such recognition." Emma studied his profile, noting the tension in his shoulders. "But—" Jackson was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that had been rebuilt after the fire. "But it would mean months apart, Emma. After everything we've built together, everything we've survived, the thought of losing our daily partnership—" "You wouldn't lose me, Jackson. This would be our project, our contribution to the territory's development, would it, Emma? They're offering you the position, recognizing your expertise. I'd be the husband who gets mentioned in passing, if at all." Emma felt a stab of understanding. Jackson had spent months learning to see her as an equal partner, but the territorial appointment would inevitably cast him in a supporting role rather than as her professional equal. "Jackson, look at me," Emma said, taking his hands in hers. "Do you remember what you said when you proposed? You said you wanted a partnership, not just a marriage." "I do remember." "Then trust that partnership now. Yes, they're offering me the official title, but everything I know about large-scale ranch management, I learned from you. Everything I understand about the business side of agricultural operations came from watching you build this ranch. You're not just my husband, you're my business partner, and any position I accept will be structured to reflect that." Jackson's expression began to soften. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we accept the position together, but on our terms. You handle the administrative and policy aspects, while I focus on the medical and technical protocols. We established a joint consulting firm based here at Rolling Creek Ranch, with the territorial appointment as just one part of our broader practice." The idea took shape as Emma spoke, and she could see Jackson's mind working through the possibilities. "A true partnership," he said slowly. "Not just Emma Hayes, Territorial Veterinary Officer, but Hayes and Hayes, Agricultural Consultants." "Exactly. We've already proven that we're stronger together than either of us could be alone. Why should we change that now?" Jackson's smile was like the sunrise after a long night. "Emma Hayes, you continue to amaze me. Yes, let's do this together. Let's build something that neither of us could create alone." A year later, Emma stood in the same spot on the ranch house porch, but everything had changed again. The Hayes and Hayes consulting firm had grown beyond their wildest projections, with offices in Cheyenne and Denver in addition to their headquarters. At Rolling Creek Ranch, Emma's veterinary protocols had been adopted as the standard throughout Wyoming territory, and were being studied by agricultural officials in Colorado and Montana, but the most significant change was the sound of laughter coming from inside the house. Their 6-month-old daughter, Margaret, playing with Mrs. Rodriguez while Jackson reviewed consultation contracts in his study. "Mama," little Margaret babbled as Emma entered the parlor. Reaching up with chubby arms that demanded immediate attention, Emma lifted her daughter, marveling as she did every day at this perfect combination of herself and Jackson. Margaret had inherited Jackson's grey eyes, but Emma's determined chin, and she showed signs of the same curious intelligence that had driven Emma to pursue unconventional dreams. "Did you have a good day with Mrs. Rodriguez?" Emma asked, settling into the rocking chair that had once belonged to Jackson's mother. "She's been practicing standing," Mrs. Rodriguez reported with fond pride. "This one's gonna be walking before her first birthday, mark my words." Jackson appeared in the parlor doorway, his expression softening as he took in the domestic scene. "How did the consultation in Laramie go?" "Successfully. The Henderson Ranch has implemented all our recommended protocols, and their cattle mortality rate has dropped by 60%. Emma shifted Margaret to a more comfortable position. "And you? How did the meeting with the Colorado officials proceed?" They want to contract with us for established veterinary standards throughout their territory. It would mean expanding our operation significantly, but the financial opportunities are substantial. Emma considered the implications, while Margaret played with the buttons on her dress. We'd need to hire additional veterinarians, establish satellite offices, develop training programs for local practitioners. Exactly what I was thinking. Emma, we're on the verge of building something that could influence agricultural development throughout the entire West. As Emma looked at her husband's excited expression, and their beautiful daughter, who would grow up believing that women could accomplish anything they set their minds to, at the thriving ranch and successful business they'd built together, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with professional achievement. She'd started this journey as the plain sister, who was dismissed and overlooked, seeking nothing more than the chance to use her veterinary knowledge in meaningful work. Instead, she'd found love, partnership, professional recognition, and a future that exceeded her most ambitious dreams. Most importantly, she'd proven that being valued for who you truly are is worth more than being admired for who others expect you to be. "Jackson," Emma said, bouncing Margaret gently as the baby began to fuss. "Whatever we decide about Colorado, whatever new challenges we take on, I want you to know that none of this would matter without you. The success, the recognition, the opportunities, they're wonderful, but they're not what makes me happy." "What makes you happy?" Jackson asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "This," Emma said simply, gesturing to encompass their home, their child, their partnership. "Us, the life we've built together, the family we're raising, the knowledge that we chose each other and keep choosing each other every day." Jackson crossed the room to sit on the arm of her rocking chair, his hand gentle on Margaret's head. "Even when that choice meant giving up easier paths?" "Especially then," Emma replied, leaning against Jackson's solid warmth. "Easy paths don't lead to extraordinary destinations." As the sun set over Wyoming territory, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Emma Hayes rocked her daughter while planning the future, with the man who'd seen past surface appearances, to recognize the extraordinary woman. Underneath, she'd been mocked as the plain sister, who would never amount to anything special. Instead, she'd become the woman who saved his cattle, stole his heart, and proved that true partnership can overcome any obstacle. And that, Emma thought as Margaret fell asleep in her arms, was the most extraordinary transformation of all. The rancher had learned to see beyond conventional beauty, to recognize real worth. The plain sister had discovered that being valued for her authentic self was the greatest prize of all, and together they'd built something that neither could have achieved alone, a love story that proved that the best partnerships are founded on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the courage to choose substance over surface every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.